Honduras, Ecuador, and Bolivia. And economic, socio-political, and environmental outcomes of sustainable development agendas. Her research focuses on export markets, decentralized natural resource control, participatory research on alternative and toxic agrochemicals, and she teaches gender and development and food security at the University of Denver. Please join me in welcoming Sally.
Thank you. It's my privilege to introduce our wonderful panel. Starting from your right, we have Andrea Stanton, an assistant professor of Islamic studies here at DU. She focuses on Islam in the Middle East. Her MA and PhDs are in Middle Eastern history from Columbia. She has a BA from Williams, and she applies all this good education to her primary research focuses on broadcast media in the 20th and 21st centuries. Most recently, she has a book chapter out on Islamic emoticons, which appear in online Islamic chat forums and websites. She has another on the celebration of Muhammad's birthday around the Middle East. This is what's hot off the press, right? Or some of the things that are hot off. Her research interests include Arab Muslim immigrant communities in the U.S. and relationships between new media technologies and religious authority. Her first book came out from UT Press in 2013 entitled This is Jerusalem Calling, State Radio in Mandate Palestine. She has a series of impressive grants, and she told me I could shorten this, so I won't list them all, but there are many and very impressive. And we're very lucky at Korbel that she has affiliated with us, with our Center for Middle East Studies and the Conflict Resolution Institute here at Korbel. And actually, you will find Andrea in religious studies, right? That's her home department, but we steal her away whenever. In the middle, we have Alejandro Cerrón, an anthropologist in the anthropology department here at DU. Alejandro is interested in social and cultural aspects of health in Guatemala. He focuses on the link between public health practice and health as a human right from the perspective of cultural epidemiology. Alejandro's medical degree was awarded in 2000, a master's in public health in 2006. Both of these are from the University of San Carlos in Guatemala, as well as a doctorate in social anthropology from the University of Washington. Here at DU, Alejandro teaches courses in research methods, cultural anthropology, medical anthropology, applied anthropology, and the social aspects of human rights in Latin America. Spencer Flournoy is director of the Nuba Christian Family Mission. This is a nonprofit charitable organization that was founded 20 years ago for the purpose of supplying religious support, but lately has also been called upon to supply food and medicine to the war-torn people in the Nuba Mountains in South Sudan. Spencer's father was a construction engineer, and Spencer grew up living all over the world. He's a gentleman of the world. His bachelor's degree is in business from Ohio State. He made his living in the oil and gas well servicing business. 10 years ago, he retired, and he sold Columbine Logging and retired. Occupies his time doing charitable work, excuse me, as a volunteer, managing his investments, and, get this, keeping a fleet of old special interest cars. And if we're good, we might get some details. In 2008, he traveled to Sudan and then south to the Nuba Mountains for the purpose of drilling water wells and building a dam. Because water storage is a big problem in this very dry area. His team was successful in doing this in a small village named Bilo. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's correct. When the South seceded from the North, war broke out. Indigenous people's homes and fields were destroyed by North Sudanese bombers and troops, forcing them to flee to caves where they had no livelihood. So his organization's mission expanded to deal with these exigencies. They provide food, medicine, salt, and soap. Every year, one of their members and a native Nubian named George Tuto make the journey from Denver to this area, and in 5 years they have completed 6 missions and have been instrumental in providing relief against gray pods. So we've got a very diverse and interesting panel, and we're going to begin with Annie.
I think actually the slides go the other way.
They go the other way?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
That's right. But I'm happy to talk about Nuba. I do.
So if you have any questions about those old cars, now that
Well, I'm about the least educated here from what I can make out. I have a bachelor's degree, but at least I did graduate, so I think that's good. I'm very honored to be here today and delighted to be in your company. I was not the original speaker. George Tutu was going to be, but as it is, my English is better than his, plus he's working full-time, so that kind of takes him away. I'm going to show basically a series of slides of work that we've done in Sudan, and also a short 4.5-minute movie here, which will highlight a lot of the people that have been over there, actually 3 of them. And what we have done is war has broken out in Sudan. The North Sudanese and the predominantly Christian and animist South Sudanese have been at war ever since time immemorial, but when South Sudan seceded from North Sudan, there was a lot of animosity, and shortly after that, starting in about 2010, 2011, the North Sudanese began regular bombing attacks on the people of the Nuba Mountains. And I know that you're all familiar with Darfur. There's also a province or a state called the Blue Nile State. And these places get routinely attacked, forcing most of the indigenous people who are agrarian, I mean they basically grow crops historically, into caves and anywhere else they can find shelter to try to keep themselves from the bombing. And that is the major reason that we bring medical supplies over there, in addition to basic foodstuffs. So this particular one highlights a journey, at least that we had good camera work on in November 2014. Last year we made 2 trips to the Nuba Mountains bringing food, and this year we have another one planned come this fall. This is a map of Northern Africa, which I know is going to be familiar to all of you. The area that we are most interested in, there we go. I don't know if this is really working or not, but this border right here, Nuba Mountains, lay to the west of the White Nile, right in this area here. There's an oil and gas pipeline that runs through there. There are evidently quite a few minerals there which really haven't been developed. And it is the home of some very proud people. And they are, for the most part, pretty well driven away. I'm going to go to a more detailed map here. And the area in question is right along this place right here. none of these names will really be terribly familiar to you, but the Nuba Mountains lay on the border between, between southern Kordofan, and that is the area that I'm going to be talking about. Just so that we're oriented, I'm going to go to this movie next, and Brianna, you told me how to start this thing, but I've now forgotten. Do I just press a button? Oh, there we go.
This is my room
Thank you.
at the Episcopal Guest House. My bed, sleeping bag.
More than 3,100 people have fled from the east side of the Nuba Mountains to here to Kodok, and their situation is being eclipsed by the conflict in South Sudan. Men, women, children have nothing. Very little food, no clean water. And because of that conflict in South Sudan, they may go completely without any of these goods, without any of the things that they need for many months. With rainy season coming just a few weeks away, time is not on their side.
These bags of sorghum for?
This sorghum is going to the refugees in the Nuba Mountain. It's not refugees, the people in the Nuba Mountain area, in Kaunyaro area. And also we have like 70 bags because the refugees who are in Kodok here, they are very much suffering. And we look at their situation and we said maybe it would be better for us to trap like 70 bags. And 160 will be going into the Kaunyaro areas. So this is what is about it now.
So when you see the people that are suffering, whether they're in Kanyaro in the Nuba Mountains or at the refugee camp here in Kodok, what goes through your mind and your heart?
It is really very disturbing, the situation. People are with the children, and sometimes you look at them, the way they live here in Kaunyaro. We didn't go to Kaunyaro, but the last time when I went to Kaunyaro. But those who I saw them in Kodok here, and the refugees camp, this is not absolutely good situation. They're living in a rain area, they have nothing to cover them, and they don't have food in the same time, and they are managing to go back seriously, but they're looking for means of transportation to take them back home, because the situation in South here is maybe very difficult for them. They can't make it. It looks like it would be better for them to go back in their own land.
What is Nuba Christian Family Mission doing to help?
Nuba Christian Family Mission is trying to raise money, but it's not also easy. But we have been blessed by different people, like one of the churches, which is Christ Church in Denver, Episcopal Church, and it's been blessed, and other organizations also, Hope Church in California, and we have also churches in Louisiana like Joining Our Voice and Hope Church and other churches. They putting their hands together at least to come up with something small that we can come and buy some of these sorghums and help with the refugees here. And this is what we are doing. Very much as a Christian Family Mission was established to stand with the Nuba wherever they are. And that's why we are doing, trying very hard, raising some funds from many places, to help people here.
Thank you.
Yeah, we are going to keep this maize or sorghum, I mean to say, for some times, because now it is raining and the situation is not good, the insecurity also. And we are hiding it because the government of Sudan, we are fearing to know that we are giving the food. So we are looking for the best time for us to sneak these things inside so that we help those who are dying. And so for now, there is no time for us to take it to those places. So we are going to keep it for some time, and then we'll take it to those places. Yeah. Approximately, I think it will be after maybe 1 week when the rain stops. Yeah.
And that is the situation there pretty much today. They are seen to be perpetually in need of food. We bring sorghum, which is basically a raw grain. You saw the ladies grinding it into what will eventually become a paste or bread, something like that. Salt, cooking oil, these items are in very high demand over there. And so, this is how we get in the location. We start in the capital, well, we fly from Denver to usually Nairobi or Kampala, Uganda. And then from there, we take a regularly scheduled flight to Juba, which is the capital of South Sudan, nowhere near the area we're working in. And then we charter this small plane to get up to location. And there, well, we haul our medicines and things like that with us. And may then make the delivery. So it's a very tortuous route that we go through to get there. Including little obstacles like getting the truck stuck that has the grain on board. So that's, we can see these young lads eagerly pushing it out of the way. We did stop for relief. This is a tea stand and kind of what passes for a store there. This lady in red essentially serves us all tea. You can see the big blue plastic water barrel to the right of her, and any kind of messages to be posted in the village are done on the blue board behind her. This is George Tutu. He is our leader, and he is standing on sacks of grain. That's about 90 kilos in each one. So we're looking at over 200 pounds per sack, but we routinely try to bring in about 2 tons of food and deliver those in large military trucks. These people are extremely colorful. They're incredibly happy despite their real problems. And you'll notice that this is all women here. Women traditionally run the villages. They traditionally make the big decisions. The men, I believe, pretty much sit around and drink tea and plan for the future. But the real work gets done by the ladies. Somehow, in all of this, they managed to keep their clothes really clean and really bright, and also to raise all of these children. This is actually distributing the grain itself to the various people. Everyone gets an allotment based on the size of their family and their need, and so this is very eagerly sought after. And this young lad here is actually the chief of the tribe. And one thing that gives me great encouragement is that he is actually keeping track, writing down how much grain, how much supplies were actually given to individual families. And then I get a copy of that afterwards. I don't read Arabic, but at least I do have good confidence that our boots on the ground, our money is going to good cause. This is Tamara Banks. You may well recognize her. She was a reporter for Channel 12, PBS, and she does a number of commercials and documentaries. She, at great risk to herself, made this trip along with George. And we also hired a security guard to go with her. Not that women are particularly threatened in Sudan, but nonetheless, we felt that somebody from outside of that country would probably be more subject to kidnapping or something terrible like that. So we definitely wanted to make sure we had her with us. And that is my presentation.
And I have 10 minutes, right? Let's see, okay. All right. So my work, as you heard before has mainly to do with health, public health in Guatemala. So I will be talking about, with the same theme of the panel, but with a focus on health and healthcare. But first I have a little commercial. Just because it is relevant. I will be using some pictures from this photographer, Jonathan Muller. And we have an exhibit at the University of Denver Museum of Anthropology. It is already open, available. You can go and take a look at the pictures there. But we have on April 14th the official opening, and there will be an activist coming to talk about the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War and what some people are trying to do to do some justice to what happened during the Civil War. But the reason why I ended up with this commercial is because I'm using some of the pictures that Jonathan shared with me. So with the topic of deterioration of human rights, I was really hoping to find data that would show how some health indicators were like this, and then during the Civil War went like this, and then after the war went like this. Couldn't find them. I couldn't find them. In part because there are not good data from the 1950s. The Civil War was roughly from 1960 to 1996, or officially from 36 years. But also because I guess social, economic, and cultural rights, there's something that happens to those rights that is different from what happens to political and civil rights during the conflict. That's my take on the whole thing. But there's this publication that came out last year. Some people collected data throughout Guatemala trying to see if there were some health effects that were clearly different among people who had suffered the impact of the Civil War more, I don't know, roughly. And what they found mainly was that there are, I don't know if you can really see that, but PTSD is really high, both among women and men in the areas that were that really suffered the violence. And then there are also some differences in terms of depression and anxiety and alcohol-related disorders. And you can see that, roughly speaking, indigenous people, women from rural areas are more affected. So this is the aftermath of the violence, right? And I'm sorry, there's a lot of stuff there, but I have to move on because I only have 10 minutes. And I already wasted 2 with my commercial. So Guatemala is a highly unequal country. Social and economic inequality has been the case forever. In fact, the country was founded on social exclusion. And throughout the country's history, we have been basically just, I don't know, adding layers of social exclusion. and if you take a look at some economic data, you will see that social inequality is not really changing. Guatemala was a highly unequal country during the war, after the war. You cannot necessarily see it here, but poverty, access to economic resources just generally, and to education is harder for women than for men. Harder for women in rural areas, harder for women who are indigenous. But a recent report that came out a few months ago kind of shocked the country, because it turns out that although what I just said is true, poverty is increasing in urban areas, both for male and female. So the country is not necessarily moving forward, right? Even after the conflict. Then there are some health indicators here. Again, available data, right? The pattern persists. You can see how in rural areas, maternal mortality is double than in urban areas. Fertility rates are almost double. Undernutrition is almost double. And you can read the rest there. Indigenous people, look at the maternal mortality for indigenous women, it's super high. And there are some parts of the country where maternal mortality can be 700. I actually worked, right after medical school, I worked in an area where that was the maternal mortality. And it was not the highest. There are some places with 900 of maternal mortality. In the US and most countries, Cuba, Costa Rica, it is less than 10, just as a reference. Same thing with chronic undernutrition among under 5 kids. There are some places where rates are, or percentages are 90%, 98%. 98% of kids under 5 are chronically undernourished. And that's after the Civil War, right? 20 years after the Civil War. So thinking in terms of deterioration, I had to think that there is a continuum of social exclusion and exclusionary ideologies that justify the social exclusion, right? That led to, among other things, to the Civil War. Most people would agree that the causes of the Civil War in Guatemala were social exclusion. So many people throughout the country were excluded from the benefits and from the resources that it ended up in a civil war. And you can see there my very synthetic take on the history of Guatemala. Just roughly divided in, there was a Mayan civilization, then there was a colonial period that was followed by what I just, maybe a little bit simplistically, called here imperialist period, and then a civil war. And the colonial and the imperialist periods were based on excluding the indigenous people, pretty much. At some point, well, at the beginning of the colonial period and the imperial period, there was also exclusion of anybody who was not from Spain, or descendant of someone from Spain. But at some point, towards the 1870s, there was a revolution that basically what it accomplished was that now it was not necessarily those who were of Spanish descent, those who were going to have more access to resources and more power. And what happened is that people from mixed race started having access to power. And it is at that time when what most people consider that the current state of social exclusion was founded. So it is now highly, really excluding indigenous people, people of mixed race may have, I guess, mixed access to power. But then in the 1960s, the Civil War started, and then starting in 1996, the peace accords were signed. And more recently, we have been trying to deal with the aftermath of the Civil War, and there have been some trials to try to bring to justice people who were responsible of the massacres that happened in the Civil War. So focusing on this Civil War and post-Civil War period, I have 4 themes that I would like to present to you very briefly that have to do with health. One has to do with traditional healers, Mayan healers. The other one has to do with health promoters. The other one has to do with health conditions. Am I on the already intended?
You got 5.
Okay, perfect, yeah. It doesn't say anything. Yeah. She said it nicely. So, 4 themes, right, that have to do with health. One is traditional healers, one is health promoters, one is health conditions, and one is the healthcare system. And I have to thank this panel that I was pushed to think really hard about how to present anything that had to do with the right to health in Guatemala during and after or before the Civil War, because my original idea of just showing you that graph didn't work out. But as I was delving into some readings and talking to friends and colleagues, I started realizing that there were all these themes that were really important. So the first one is traditional healers. Basically, rural Guatemala, especially indigenous Guatemala, was I don't know, abandoned, forgotten, unacknowledged by Guatemalan institutions before the Civil War. And although that was really bad, one of the effects that had was that the rich tradition of Mayan healers thrived in that environment. But then during the Civil War, because they were leaders, not just traditional healers, but also leaders, there was persecution and repression. Before the Civil War, there was discrimination for being indigenous and for being from rural areas. But during the Civil War, well, I guess their political rights were really suffered the most. After the Civil War, there has been some revitalization movement. Some traditional healers, like Mayan priests or Akihab, they are pretty much recognized now by, I don't know, a lot of people, but they still suffer discrimination for being indigenous people. Then, health promoters. Guatemala is well known in international health for being one of those places where health promoters, rural health promoters, community health promoters began to organize themselves in the 1950s and 60s, and they inspired health promoters movements all over the world. That happened in Guatemala partly because of the state of abandonment that most rural areas were in. But one of the effects of that was that there was a really strong and organized network of health promoters that were supported by different international organizations and some Guatemalan organizations. And that created a very strong tradition of questioning health and health problems from a broad social and economic perspective, and also this tradition of just organizing to do something. During the Civil War, they were also, repression and persecution targeted them as well. But at the same time, resistance happened partly because of that network, that organized network of health promoters that were leaders and that were in touch with people from outside their communities. A lot of the human rights related efforts after the Civil War have relied on these networks of solidarity. Perfect. Then health conditions. The numbers that I was able to look at basically showed that there was stagnation, no improvement on maternal mortality or immunization, undernutrition, that kind of thing. Pretty much stayed the same during the Civil War. And after the Civil War, you basically see improvement, but not everybody's getting the benefits of that improvement at the same rate. And the healthcare system, basically it was absent in rural Guatemala before the Civil War and during the Civil War, and it was kind of mixed in urban Guatemala. And you can see some improvement with mixed results and with inequalities that are increasing after the Civil War. And that's it.
Andrew, would you pass my time?
Oh, yes. I don't get to hold them. In the Middle East, we're really familiar with dictatorships. All right, well, I'm kind of sorry that I don't get to talk about Nuba, because I think actually your project is a little more optimistic. And so as I was trying to sort out what I was going to say, I actually thought maybe I'd just do this slide and then just sit back down, because really what can you say? How can I fill 10 minutes in talking about the current situation in Syria? But what I do actually want to do is not do that, because that's irresponsible. But I do want to talk through a couple of key points and kind of how to think about the transition from pre-conflict to current conflict, and then a couple of takeaways. And I think we might actually have some interesting resonances encapsulated here by some scribbled notes between what Spencer and Alejandro have been speaking on. So the Syria, I was just talking about this with some of my Syrian American students yesterday, but the story kind of before the conflict was, I think for the most part, from an external perspective, no awareness of Syria, quite frankly. I don't think the vast majority of Americans ever thought about Syria, and I remember being out talking to someone from the US Embassy, maybe in 2004, who said that at most they estimated there were 1,000 Americans spread throughout Syria. It was really kind of unknown space. But politically speaking, since kind of 2005, the EU had really been warming up to Syria, and since about 2009, there were a lot of US initiatives to warm up to Syria, and so I think that's helpful in framing. I put some kind of Human Rights Watch comments up here that are pretty hard-hittingly negative about Syria. None of it is a surprise if you know the country, and none of it was new in 2010. But the bigger picture, the kind of the EU political picture and the US political picture was that there was really kind of a thought. I mean, bring in your like Cold War, bad weather metaphor of choice, and John Kerry was there, John McCain was there. There was a lot of effort to bring in Syria, which I think from a human rights perspective meant that the human rights issues kind of faded, and there were much more stories about the economics. This was also, kind of the launching point of the famous Vogue article, for those of you who are Vogue subscribers, about Asma al-Assad, and so the human rights violations were treated much more subtly, and so I think if we're trying to kind of frame what shifts between pre-conflict and conflict, it's much more of an amplification and intensification of the human rights issues, not the creation of them. And I think I was trying to think about this also in terms of kind of how we conceptualize violence and violations, and this was essentially structural violence within the framework of a sovereign state, and therefore it's much less visible. And now what we see in conflict, whether we're talking about regime-controlled areas, so-called rebel-controlled areas, or ISIS-controlled areas, or refugee areas, is really the kind of exceptional violence, which tends to be much, much more visible. So we can kind of frame it that way. And then I put here also, because we're supposed to be talking about resources, that the resources in Syria were really good. I missed the electricity when I moved to Beirut, because Beirut had brownouts every day, unless you were in the administrative district. And whereas there were no brownouts. I mean, once a tree fell on a power line when I was living in Abu Dhabi, but aside from that, you know, the infrastructure was great. The human rights stuff was bad, but the infrastructure was great. The tertiary, I mean, literacy rates were very high for men and women. Tertiary sector higher education was good for men and women. It was a highly functional, highly stable, highly dictatorial state, and that's important because I think for those of you who saw Wendy Perlman when she was here last fall, and she's been working a lot with former current activists who are now also refugees, and that was saying that this is one of the really difficult questions, which isn't even being asked yet, but is being started to be, I think, wrestled with contemplatively, which is, was it worth it? You know, was the choice to rise up ultimately not worth the cost? And that's a really hard question. It's a hard moral question. It's a hard practical question. But I think that's also key to keep in mind. So the regime-governed areas, I'm borrowing a metaphor from the presidential election here, a race to the bottom. But I think here, in what we're seeing, again, to think of it in terms of kind of the state, is that we're seeing a failing state, which is a really interesting analytical moment. It's a horrible moment to live through, but analytically, boy, there's a lot of Foucauldian interpretive work to be done here. That it's not a failed state, it's a failing state. And failing states, like wounded animals, are profoundly desperate, right? And so I think that helps explain I mean, brutality is not even the right word for it, right? The attempts to murder your own citizens, right? This is not what a state does. A state, whether it likes people or not, wants them around as productive bodies, as tax-paying bodies, as manipulatable bodies, but as bodies that it can work with. That's a modern state. And a failing state doesn't have that option. It has to sort out the traitors from the non-traitors, the danger from the non-dangers. And I think that's what we're seeing with the real intensification of the atrocities on the regime level. In terms specifically, just to highlight one brief moment, I would actually say if we're looking at gendered stuff, and I would say that it's very hard to bracket gender if you're going to talk about, well, the world, but also the Middle East, that really I think it's men who are hit harder in regime areas because they are the targets of impressment into the military and or they are the suspected regime antagonists. And women, I think, also suffer in many other ways, but don't suffer politically in the same ways. So for in terms of us, the bigger picture questions, I think it was, as Spencer was talking about, I was thinking about is how do we conceptualize the kind of spectrum of state involvement when we're thinking about human rights violations, a stable state, a failing state, and also an antagonistic state versus an absent state, right? How do we kind of map out the different kinds of violations that, that fit there? ISIS, I find also analytically just fascinating for all kinds of reasons that are not really relevant here. But I would just highlight that it's not inherently better or worse than being in a regime-governed area. It provided a lot of law and order. It provided a lot of the kind of baseline resource infrastructure, stability, literal law and order. It's a very bureaucratic approach to being an extremist organization. They really care about governance, not in the way that we might want them to, but they really care about it. And so it's obviously better for minoritarian communities. It's obviously worse. It's obviously much worse if you're a Shiite or Yazidi or potentially Christian. But it's a real race to the bottom there too, right? Which is worse? Which would you rather live under less? the Assad regime or ISIS. Where I think we see with ISIS is that they seem to have started out really strong with a real strong commitment to being a state, and now that the money is drying up, I think we're going to see a much more intense fracturing and probably a lot more brutality, and also much less of the kind of ruler-ruled promises that were being made in terms of law and order and governance. Not really much positive to say there. Refugees, I think, face a bunch of different kinds of challenges that are less, again, about the overt violence, less about exceptional violence, and more about the structural violence caused by other states. And I think we particularly saw that with the kind of start of the new visa regimes in Lebanon and the intensified border closures in Jordan and Turkey, which all started in 2015 and then again restarted in 2016, and we know the new EU pact with Turkey now. And those are, again, they're the less kind of exceptional brutal violence, but in terms of getting people into a place of safety, those are profound issues. And then all of the other stuff that we all know, right? Food insecurity, also issues with basic resources, work permits, education, and just the really standard stuff. In the gender issue here, I think that what we're actually seeing, we know always, right, in cases of non-voluntary immigration / refugees, right? There's a whole set of new pressures that are put on men and a whole set of pressures associated with the challenges of masculinity. For women, when I talk with Syrian women, the picture seems much more mixed. On the negative side, what we're seeing, particularly in education, which is primarily what I've worked with, Syrian families who would have been totally content to send their daughters to a different city to go to Damascus University or Aleppo University will not send their daughters away now because they are afraid. They are afraid that the situation has been so destabilized. Even if they're in Turkey, it's much harder to convince them to send their daughters to a different city in Turkey for college or to send them overseas. On the other hand, there are a lot of arguments that, as with any wartime condition, women have a lot of new opportunities, that social codes are being broken. That's usually explained to me in the context of romance. So there you have it. In any case, and then of course there are the Palestinians in Syria, who I think also just have gotten left out of the whole conflict, the whole conversation. But in closing, the kind of two takeaways that I would really hit, and then I have some other secret takeaways that now I've added on. What I see is, number one, and I was looking at the UDHR, UMDHR, when I was putting this together, and it struck me of how irrelevant so many of the articles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are. And so that's one thing that plays out in two different ways. And one of them is we have no way to talk about the ways in which human rights violations become normalized and normativized. And so what I'm really concerned about, we just hit the 5-year mark of this conflict, and what I'm really concerned about is the Palestinianization of Syrians, the sense that it's really too bad, what a terrible thing, what a hard life for so many people, but we're not gonna be able to do anything about it, right? This is just how it is, this is the status quo, and that's what happened when you start to see a conflict going stale, and I think I'm really, really concerned about that. But the other part of this is what I would say the kind of, really? Because I have that I've been talking for 11 minutes. Are you giving us 15 minutes?
I believe that's.
Oh, okay, great. All right. Okay. Well, Alejandra said 10, and so I got hooked on the 10. Okay. Well, I can talk time, so I can bore you for another 4 minutes then. Perfect. So the other thing I see is this issue again of the Declaration of Human Rights. Really, to me, seems to be kind of second-order human rights, and there are people who talk about this in different ways. One of them is Giorgio Agamben, who I posted on Facebook asking for help with the pronunciation of his last name. Everyone apparently is divided between Agamben and Agamben, so you can choose whichever way you want. But he talks about the kind of distinction between the social human and the bare human, and I think that's what we're also seeing here. And he's not the only person. I'm certainly not the only person to talk about that. But we need to think about a kind of bare human, physical body, safety, food, the stuff that you learn about in elementary school about the kind of basic needs versus wants stuff of humanity. Food and shelter, that's just actually not captured in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and yet it's kind of a precursor for all this other stuff. And so that's one aspect, but this other aspect is also that we need to conceptualize the way in which we think of human rights in the context of retaining individuation, right? So what happens when you become a refugee? You become part of this blob. What happens when you become an IDP? You become part of a blob. What happens when you become part of a conflict-ridden state or a conflict-ridden society? You're part of that blob, and it's a way of stripping out kind of the individual dignity and autonomy of each person, and I think that's something that I'm also extremely concerned about, and we don't really have a way to conceptualize that in political terms. So let me just let me just really end by saying something that's also really not very cheering. Which is that there's really nothing positive to say here, but I'm going to end by returning and picking up on something that Alejandro said earlier, which is that in conflict, issues of social and cultural rights are not commensurate as the issues that happen with political rights. So if we're thinking about human rights violations and the deterioration of the social and cultural spheres, as well as the deterioration of the political spheres in conflict, those aren't actually all the same. So if and when there is a resolution, I think it's historically been much easier to focus on the political aspect and much more challenging to focus on the social and the cultural. And I think of that, for me in particular, with another kind of long lingering post-conflict society that I know fairly well, which is Lebanon. And I think you can still see long-standing PTSD, long-standing other lost education opportunities that translate into lost job opportunities, lost societal development opportunities that have translated into a lack of social maturation in certain ways. And so I think if and when there is a resolution, we also need to a way to keep focus on the distinctions between the social and cultural realms and the political realms, and remember that the political gets the lion's share of the attention, but the social and cultural rebuilding is also an important process too. So I'll close there.
Thank you very much. And on that note,
I got 4.
let's pick up the theme of long-standing conflicts that, as several has been mentioned more than once by the panel, that one of the themes that is emerging from today's comments is that stages of violence can blend into one another, or stages of conflict. You have social conflict, political conflict, that then escalates in ways that become militarized, and all of a sudden you got a, quote, civil war. And in the case of Guatemala, it's been 20 years now since the peace accords, and yet, Alejandro will correct me on this if my impression is incorrect, but there still seems to be a great deal of normalized